Hello everyone. As informed in the last session, in today's video, we shall learn the internal components of the computer. I mean the parts on the motherboard. Before learning the components individually, we first learn what a motherboard is. If we take the case of the computer, now, how do we do that? Here's an example for basic computer case. This front part called the front bezel that gives access to optical drives like CD-ROM and floppy disk drives. Most computer cases have power and reset button on the bezel. Some computer cases will have access to other ports or components like USBs, audio jack and microphone jack, etc. The back panel of the computer case allows access to the power supply, some integrated components on the motherboard, and input-output cards. Some computer cases are toolless cases. Now what are these? It does not require any tool to remove the case, and we have to be very careful with these type of cases. Just by pressing the lever down, the side panel gets unlocked and we can remove the case. This gives access to inside of the case. There are some other computer cases that have screws which have to be removed, and the side panels will have a notch to hold the panel, and once it's removed we can see many parts of the computer. Now all these parts are integrated, they're together. How? They're all tied together by this one component called motherboard. Everything that runs the computer or that enhances the performance of the computer are either the part of the motherboard or plugs into the motherboard. Now motherboard can also be defined as, now if we assume the computer to be the body and the processor as the brain, then motherboard does what a heart does for a human being. The motherboard supplies power and makes all components communicate with each other. So the formal definition of motherboard is, it is a printed circuit board which ties all the components together and allows all parts of the motherboard to receive power and help them to communicate with each other. I repeat, it's a printed circuit board which ties all the components together and allows all parts to receive power and help them to communicate with each other. This is the most commonly asked one-mark question in your exams, and hence please make a note of that. And next in the syllabus we have the characteristics and types of motherboard, but it makes sense to learn about it only after learning the parts of the motherboard. By the way, who manufactures motherboard? Now here are some top companies that manufacture motherboards: Gigabyte Technologies, EVGA Corporation, Asus Tech, Microstar International, and so on. Now that we have understood what a motherboard is, we shall look into the components present on the motherboard. The CPU is the first thing that comes to mind when people think about computers' speed and performance. Faster the processor, faster the computer can think. The processor fits into the processor socket which is present on the motherboard. By the way, processor, CPU, central processing unit all means one and the same. Now, previously, all processors had the same set of pins, which meant any processor would fit into any motherboard. And the set of pins that I am talking about that connect to the motherboard are called as pin grid array, in short PGA. Now that the microprocessors are advancing, so it requires more pins to handle new features and provide more power to the chip. Now this point on PGA I'm stressing a lot because it is important when we have a specific processor in mind. If you have a specific processor in mind and want to fit that to a motherboard, don't think you can purchase any motherboard and fit it into that. You need to select a motherboard with the right socket for that specific processor. Remember, your processor will not fit into any socket on any motherboard. The pins on the processor have to match with the socket on the motherboard, and this is one of the characteristics of motherboard. I repeat, one of the characteristics of the motherboard. We understood that CPU is inserted to the CPU socket. Then how do we define a CPU? The microprocessor, MUP, CPU, you call it by any name. It is an integrated chip responsible for fetching, decoding and executing program instructions and mathematical calculations. Talking about CPUs, the top companies that manufacture processors are Intel and AMD. What processor is there in your system? To know this, you can click on Properties of My Computer, which displays the processor in your system, and along with that we find some numbers beside something written as GHZ or MHZ. Now this number states the speed at which the processor is executing. I repeat, the speed at which the processor is executing, and this is called as clock speed. It is defined as the frequency at which processor executes the instruction. It is usually expressed in megahertz and gigahertz. Next, we have a display of how CPU is inserted to the CPU socket, and the video is sponsored by AMD Corporation.
Installing a new processor is one of the most important things that you can do on your PC. It's the brain of the computer after all. You'll be able to take the AMD Ryzen CPU out of its bubble packaging. And when you do that, take note. In the lower left-hand corner, there is a golden triangle. That golden triangle lines up with a triangle that's also on our processor socket. So you'll want to turn the CPU to match the two triangles up. And then you lift the metal arm on the CPU socket, and then you simply drop the processor into the socket. My CPU dropped in effortlessly. It should feel really easy to install this CPU. If it's not easy, then the CPU is either installed in the wrong orientation or you've not yet raised the metal retention arm on the socket. So once the CPU is installed, you can simply put that metal arm back down, and now the CPU is installed.
Our next component found on the motherboard are slots. Basically, slots are openings or sockets on the motherboard where we insert cards. Now, by cards, I mean circuit boards. By inserting the cards to the slots, the features or capabilities of the computer gets expanded. Hence, they are popularly called expansion slots. The cards that I'm speaking about include graphics card, sound cards, video cards, Ethernet cards, memory cards, and so on. Looking at this picture especially, you can understand how adding memory card to your mobiles increases the storage capacity of the mobiles. Similarly, expansion slots increases the capabilities of the computer system. Well, there are numerous expansion slots, and it is very important to know the full forms of them from your exam point of view. But before getting into the types of slots, I run you through a small video which demonstrates how cards are added to the expansion slots. By this, I hope you get a fair idea on what slots are and what cards are. Well, that was installation of a network card to the system. The cable that connects the modem to the system is plugged to this network interface card. So that expanded the system's capabilities to have internet connections, right? So that is what is expansion slots expand the capabilities of the system. Well, moving on to the much awaited types of slots. The first one is ISA, which stands for Industry Standard Architecture. This was introduced by IBM, and ISA was designed to connect peripheral cards to the motherboard. Initially, during 1980s, the motherboards were largely having ISA slots. But the modern computers no longer have ISA slots. Instead, they use PCI slots. PCI, which stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect. It is an expansion slot introduced by Intel in 1992. The PCI is also designed to support network card, video card, sound card and others. Well, the number of PCI slots depends on the user's requirement, on the manufacturer and model of the motherboard. From 1990s to 2000s, this was the most commonly used slots. But today, very few motherboards come with the PCI slots because they are being replaced by PCIe. But those motherboards that still do come with the PCI slots will generally have 1 to 3 PCI slots. Our next one is PCIe, which stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect Express slots. This was introduced in 2002. As the name Express suggests, it has higher potential and greater flexibility than PCI. The next one is the AGP slot. It stands for Accelerated Graphics Port. Now please note this point, though it has the word port, it is not a port but a slot. In the next videos to come, we see ports in detail, so please don't give any space for confusions. It is an expansion slot designed specifically for graphics card. Today, even AGPs are also replaced with PCI Express slots. Well, our last slot is the RAM slots. Undoubtedly, we can say these are the slots where we insert RAM. But what type of RAM? To understand this in detail, it requires the knowledge of RAM and its types. So this part of the syllabus was taught to you in the 11th standard. Please brush it up so that it's easy for us to continue the next concept, which is the RAM slot. Well, that's it for today. As mentioned in the previous session, the material for today's video can be downloaded from www.csfoundation.co.in website. Now, this video was presented by Ashwini SN, Head of the Department of Computer Science, ASC Independent PU College. I leave you with some important questions from the topics we have studied today. So please see to it that you are thorough with these questions before we meet next.